The average income in retirement right now in Canada, 2024 Stats Canada says a couple or a family, so these are seniors, is 74,200. That is the average income for a family in retirement. Individuals, it's 33,600. This is the average retirement income. And in this episode, we want to talk about this to answer some questions about how much we think is enough. Also, how do we compare? But also for most of us listening, thinking about like, is what I'm planning for the right amount based off where my living expenses is, because that sounds awfully low for the way I've probably been living. And therefore is like, maybe I've been overestimating. So we want to talk about that. We want to talk about how to think about this and really a mindset, but also kind of a framework to focus in on when you're thinking about retirement income levels, because there's lots of frameworks out there. There's the 4% rule. There's like, hey, I'm going to multiply by 25, which is really the your 4% rule, really just phrased a different way. But then there's there's other kind of frameworks that people say follow. The F.I.R.E community, doing one thing versus another. So we're going to talk about that. Kyle, what do you think right off the bat? What's your take when I say 33,600 for an individual and 74,000 for a family or a couple in retirement?
Yeah, I think what it is I think a lot of people listening to this podcast are probably looking at that and feeling the same way you are. And I feel the same. Now, this is an average, right? So, I mean, we're talking about an average across a large span of households across Canada. So, there's every mix in there. And, it doesn't really help a whole lot because we're living our own lifestyle. And I think this is really what we want to be discussing today is like, how do you figure out what that might look like and sound like? And, back on our retirement series, we went on deep dives. We went over 4 episodes, went down the rabbit hole. We tried to share some scenarios if we had equity portfolios, like all of these things. But the reality is like, we actually have no clue what the future is going to look like and sound like, right? This past year, I had a client reach out and said, like I did blank percent. I think he said something like 30% with his portfolio is self-managing. I'm like, that's amazing. Like, that's awesome. But like, are you going to do it again this year? And I don't think he'll have an answer for me on that, right? We don't know what the future holds. And, really, I think what we want to talk about today is really just trying to share a couple strategies that can help you at least get closer to the end goal that you're after through consistency, through simplification, and allow things to happen as they may while putting yourself in a position where if you follow some of these ideas, if you think about some of these basic ideas, you can get yourself structured in such a way that you can almost, without thinking about it, know that you'll likely be just fine.
Yeah, when you think about those numbers, in a way, it doesn't matter. Like you said, it's not mattering how much the average is. It matters what you are currently spending in your lifestyle expenses, and saying this is what my life looks like. This is on my monthly budget. Like we were saying right before we started recording, is that we treat our budgets differently. Whereas I'm a penny to penny, dollar to dollar tracker. I know, I could at any given moment whip up exactly where we spent $1, last month, and making sure that we're following a budget that we set up front. Whereas you're kind of like a lagging budgeter. You're kind of saying like, I have a number in mind of what we generally spend per month on our family expenses. And at the end of the month, I look at to see, did we hit it or were we under it? But I think, when I think about those is both of us, and this is why it doesn't matter about your retirement levels of what the income is. It matters on what the savings rate is. So both of us in, me having a very specific dollar to dollar budget, there is a chunk, there's a line item in that budget, there's actually a few different line items in that budget that a tally for the future John, the future or family money, which is like investments, retirement savings, RRSP contributions, tax-free savings account contributions, real estate, like all of these things add up in sort of a category, which is really paying myself first and thinking about the future, which is in a way our savings rate. We are saving a certain amount of our income. You're doing the exact same because you're just saying at the end of the month, this is where I draw the line. And on the other side of the line, you also have a savings rate and you're saying I'm contributing, or I'm making sure I contribute X amount of dollars towards that same future Pierce family. And I think when we think about how much retirement money we're going to need, we need to think about that number as well. Because I think a lot of times it's like we put extra over here, or we're contributing this, or we're making sure we're putting any of these dollars away. But I think, and you brought this to light, recently, is that savings rate plays a huge role in a few different ways into what you're doing now, but really what you're doing later. And I think most of us forget about how much that savings rate really factors into today's calculations on how much you're going to need.
100%. Now, in today's discussion, we're not going to factor inflation into the discussion. We want to keep this pretty easy to understand and really just kind of visualize for yourself. Now, inflation's a factor. We do need to consider this. So as you get deeper into something like this and some of this planning, that will impact things. But let's pretend for a second that there is no inflation. A dollar is a dollar, and it, same cost for milk as, now as it does in the future, just to keep things sort of apples to apples. Because today we're going to be talking and using sort of a bit of proportional thinking here in terms of how we do things. And I think in general, a lot of people definitely have thought about this before, where they say, okay, well, when I retire, I'm not going to have as many expenses. For example,
Sure.
I might not have kids at home, right? Now, that's actually not true for a lot of these early retirement sort of seekers, right? We have these FIRE seekers out there that sometimes they do have kids at home. So that's not that helpful. Some people, it's I'm not going to have a mortgage, right? 100%. That's definitely something that we can factor in. But if we do this well, and if we really just want to boil things down and we think about, okay, I've got 100% of my income coming in each and every year right now, it's probably better to think about it after any taxes, okay? Just because this is the money that's flowing into your world for now. And you were to commit a certain amount of it towards your future self, right? And we're talking about paying yourself. We can talk about, call it investing, call it saving, call it whatever you want. But ultimately, it's if we can commit a certain percentage. Now, one thing I know for certain, if I commit 0% and I do that for a very long time, that's not going to attribute to a very good retirement income, right? Because I'm going to probably be stuck with CPP and eventually OAS, and you'll probably have to work a whole lot longer, and you're going to have to live potentially on a whole lot less. So the idea here is okay, we can use the rule of thumb and say every paycheck you take 10%. And I'm going to use net. I'm going to talk about after taxes. 10% of your income goes to one of these buckets. That's sort of a rule of thumb. And I would argue it's a good rule of thumb if you started the day you got your first job, if you did that back when, let's say you were in your 20s or whatever, and you did that consistently until you were 65, that number would be pretty awesome. However, a lot of people are thinking first of all, a lot of times we start late. Nobody wants to start late, but we do start late. And a lot of people don't want to work as long either. I don't know if we're just lazier in general, or if we just recognize that, hey, working a really long time, there's only so much time here. It's my only finite asset. So I'm going to argue we want more than 10% in general per year. But here's the nuance, the part that I think is really positively, impacting your mindset around this whole thing is the higher we can make that rate. So if I can push it to 20%, if I can push it higher, if you're a high income earner and you can push your actual savings or investing rate to like 40 or 50%, what you're doing is two things. You're not only giving yourself such a great opportunity to create more wealth, to create more, lifestyle opportunity later, or maybe early retirement, but you're also creating an opportunity where you only have to replace half of that after-tax income that you've been earning. Because this whole time you've been taking half of it and chucking it into that later bucket.
Right.
So it's
You're not
like
gonna
you're
do
getting
it
two
later.
wins. Yeah, like you're getting two wins. It's not just about setting yourself up, for later. And a lot of times that's like the marshmallow test. Like, some people just want to eat that marshmallow now instead of waiting for someone to come back to give you two marshmallows. You want to just deal with it now. But here you get this other win where it's like you have less expenses to deal with later because you've almost forced yourself into a much more conservative or living below your means standard of living, which kind of gives you almost like a double compounding effect, so to speak.
Totally. And I think most of us, when we're doing this planning, right, like when you're thinking about your 4% rule, if you're using that as a guideline, like you don't factor that part in. I bet you haven't, and if you have, then give yourself a pat on the back. But I mean, like the fact that you're like, okay, right now my budget is let's say I'm spending $10,000 a month to live, and just make my numbers easier, and going, okay, well, if this chunk of money I'm putting into my savings rate, I'm taking 10%, I'm putting I'm putting that $1,000 over there, then actually you only have to account for $9,000 when you retire, because it's like you're not going to keep contributing that $1,000. So we don't think about that. We think, oh, I have to replace $10,000. And so you maybe have estimated how much you actually need using the 4% rule. If you're, say, multiplying your current expenses by 25 to get how much you need in that pot so that you can start safely withdrawing to account for all of your expenses. But I think you phrase this, you've kind of flipped this on its head a little bit for someone to think about, because you use 90%, 10% savings rate as an example. So for example, like if I'm putting 10% away in my savings rate, then this is why time and the compounding rate plays a huge role in this. And this is what we had our 4-part series on the math behind early retirement. We went into like timing, we went into like the sequence of returns to figure out all of these like very nuanced details. But in a way, it's like, this is the easy way to think about it, because time can help you here. If you're you gave that example of that person starting out. Why the person starting out can actually put 10% away and it works is because time and compounding allow for the 10% you're saving has to account for 90% of your expenses when you go to retire. So that 10% over time will, you have to do a little bit of, extrapolation here to figure out, was if I put 10% away, and then if I do this for blank number of years, will that withdrawal rate now be able to account for the 90% I need now? And so that's why if you can push that up, if you can push your savings rate up, because if you're starting later, you have to you have to figure that out. Like if I make it 40%, then if I'm putting 40% away of my salary or my income now, then I only like that 40% over time, stretch that out over time, stretch that out over your interest rate. That 40% has to account for 60% withdrawal rate. Like that's to account for that 60% per year withdrawal rate. So the higher you can push, the better you are later in life. But when you start early, that's why that number for most of us is a lot smaller, because you're accounting for the other half, or I don't want to say half, the other section of your 100%. And I think sometimes we don't think of it like that.
Yeah. And I think when you think about, as you explore this idea, right, I think one of the challenges, and I'm on calls all week long. I love chatting with folks from the podcast community, as well as those who come in through our website and other means. And I have conversations. And what I find which is really interesting, is that it doesn't actually matter how much income an individual earns, whether they earn it as a T4, whether they earn it inside a corporation because they're a business owner, or even they might have a professional corporation like a doctor and so forth. What I find is like, as this number goes higher, it's the same challenge. Like, it's like, how much should I be putting away? And just sort of like losing sight or losing sense of this idea that it's like, I'm earning a lot of money now. So in your mind, I think almost like the more money you earn, I think the more you think you'll be okay. Right. Because you're like, I'll be fine. Like, I earn a lot of money. And I think it's the opposite. I think the more money you earn, it's almost like the more, maybe, lackadaisical you are about it, right? Where you go like, well, I'll just keep working longer. I just, I'll this or I'll that. And it's like, it's actually so much harder because like, if you only stick to say 10%, and, you do start late. Let's pick a medical doctor, for example. They have big debt to take care of, right? They take on a lot of debt and a lot of schooling, which means they start working later, which probably means they start saving later. They start investing later, which means they have less time to compound. But here's the bigger issue is that they get used to that high income, and that high income just becomes a part of who they become. And it becomes a harder and harder thing to deal with later. It means that they'll have to work for a very long time. And that's awesome if they love doing what they do. I spoke to a doctor recently. He's like, I'm probably never going to retire. And I was like, neither am I. Like, I don't know why I care about this so much, because like, I love doing what I do and I love engaging and I love working. But I want to just know that I'm ready at any moment, because you know what? Like, life happens and things change really fast. Like, if something were to happen in my life to like change how I want to prioritize my time, right? And I don't even want to talk about examples, but you think about people you care about, or you think about, other opportunities in life. I want to be able to do them, right? Because I don't know who I'm going to be 10 years from now. But the one thing I do know is that, boy, oh boy, if I can save more of that monthly, weekly, biweekly, I don't care how this money's coming in, if I could save a higher percentage of that, what I do know is that it's going to take less time in order for me to replace the actual portion that I am utilizing. And here's the interesting part. Like, you can keep it as simple as that. You can think of it this way and go, you know what? I'm going to commit to a higher percentage and let it ride and do no more thinking. And you're probably going to be in good shape. Now, mind you, you want to make sure you're putting it into assets, right? You want to make sure that, maybe you have some guidance there, whether it's, your financial advisor, whether you want to get on a call with us and chat with us about things. Whatever you choose to do, just make sure that you're confident in what you're putting that money into. But here's the other nuance, is that if we do this, the higher the percentages, the less risk I need to take on, or less risk that I, when I say need, like, need is a really tough word, but it's like, I might just choose not to go as risk on, or maybe I only have to be risk on with half of my portfolio. Because here's the thing that, is really hard to predict. It's hard to predict how you're going to feel when an asset goes wrong, right? When an investment goes wrong, when you're upfront and you think about all the upside, even if you consider the risk, you don't know how you're truly going to feel unless it actually happens. So for me, I think that's a big piece. And if you want to go deeper, you can go deeper and you can say, well, you know what? By this year, I shouldn't have a mortgage anymore. Or I shouldn't have these other expenses. Feel free to do that. I personally don't even want to do that. You know why? Because I want that to be bonus. Like, I look at it from like a bonus perspective and say, if I could replace what I'm spending now, and it's like, it's only going to get better down the road, because like, my kids aren't going to have, all their sports and this and school and all those things. And I won't have a mortgage potentially. Like, I just want to prepare. So it's like, I would just rather be in a position where I don't have to worry about it. I don't have to consider it. And hopefully I'm looking at a lot more than maybe I ever needed to have available, so that I can do whatever it is I want with my time.
What you're talking about is creating a margin of safety. in creating that margin of safety around your future self is padding the ends, or padding the worst case scenarios, and but also padding the best case scenarios, and going, I'm fine with this scenario because I'm planning for that margin of safety. And when you plan, this is what we do when we invest in real estate. This is what we do when we invest in say any of the equities that we're managing, is how do we plan for that margin of safety, and what is that plan? This is what we're doing in our, for planning for retirement, and thinking about those numbers. And I think today the two big things, right, is to think about the savings rate and savings percentage of like what you can get away with and what you can plan for, which really is you planning for a margin of safety, which is the other thing. It's like, how can you build a margin of safety into your planning? And then how do you make sure that you are really considering how much expenses you're going to need and how much you're actually socking away for right now? Because a lot of times we hope for the best and we haven't really planned. And what you want to do is do that planning, is to go, what is that number that I'm looking to do? And like what Kyle said, the margin of safety is plan for the expenses right now, and then you're factoring in a little bit of margin of safety along the way.
I love it. And, as you move along, I'm in my early 40s, John, you're in your early mid 40s now, I believe it is. And, when we think about these things too, I think the other piece that, you want to just be aware of, like, first and foremost, it's getting that routine under control. So like, get on a routine and get it sent off. And honestly, again, I'm not going to sit here and say, listen, if you send it and put it into mutual funds that have high fees, guess what? It's still better than not doing something. You can always address that. That's something you can always address, but you need to do something. So don't allow analysis paralysis as to where it should go stop you from getting yourself going. Now, of course, getting support and starting to think about, how you want to diversify is a really important piece here. I'm going to admit, I was all in on real estate for the past decade or so. And guess what? Looking back on it, I don't regret doing any of that. However, looking back, I now recognize that that wasn't really a super safe approach, even though it felt really, really good at the time. And it still is something that we have, but we're now kind of focusing on other asset classes and also some safety buckets as well, right? So you've heard us talking about insurance, and we've talked about these whole life policies and such. So, regardless of what your asset mix is, the key right now is making sure you get on that routine. And over time, you will be maybe shuffling some things around. But if you can get yourself get your head wrapped around this idea that you don't have to get a super high return in order to make sure that you're going to be in a great spot, that gives you an opportunity to do real thinking instead of sort of panicked thinking along the way. And of course, we encourage you to reach out at any point. If you are an incorporated business owner, for example, and you have a lot of retained earnings there each and every year because you're being smart.
Right. You got a savings rate.
Right. You're being smart about how much you're saving. Like, if you're an incorporated business owner and every dollar that you earn comes out of the corporation for lifestyle, there's not a whole lot we can do from a tax planning perspective. However, if you're taking out what you need for lifestyle and there's still money sort of left there, it doesn't matter if it's a small amount or a large amount, there are some creative structures that we can utilize in order to help you over the long term save a boatload in taxation. So reach out to us over at CanadianWealthSecrets.com/discovery. And hey, if you haven't yet, hop into our free masterclass that's designed specifically for incorporated business owners over at CanadianWealthSecrets.com/masterclass. If you're a T4 employee, we haven't forgot about you. Head on over to the website and check out how we can help you as well over at CanadianWealthSecrets.com.